For pretty much all of the game's existence, healing has been in a very weird spot. From the time when you had to rush a Bramble Vest or Executioners just to have a chance of winning against champions with healing, to when playing a champion with healing was borderline trolling because a single 800 cost item stat checked you. Over the years, we've seen a few attempts from Riot to address the issues that healing has, but despite their efforts, it's still a very sore spot for the game that even today causes issues and frustrations, despite the solutions being to just gut most sources they could. So this is what I want to talk about today, not only looking at the problems and some potential solutions, but also looking past just fixing what we have and looking at what the future of healing could look like. Today, we're talking about the state of healing. Starting off, we have the more general or universal issues, which begins with the increase in time to kill. Over the years, we've seen damage progressively power creep through various sources, which ended up making fights quicker and more burst oriented. And for something like healing that has a very heavy emphasis on time, needing to heal back damage taken over a longer fight, rather than resistances that reduce damage immediately, the decrease in time to kill had a parallel decrease in healing's effectiveness. This meant that over the years, despite healing not changing, healing ended up getting progressively worse and overshadowed by resistances or just building damage of your own, which pushed healing out of favor as a build option due to it being objectively weaker in most situations. And while the next step in most cases would have been to simply buff healing sources to compensate, the problem with this is due to the next two issues, which are the lead issue and offensive scalings, which both go hand in hand. What I mean by the lead issue is that having a lead in League is a very impactful thing. A lead means more base stats through a level lead, better abilities through more points invested, often the strong effects of a full item compared to the enemy's components, lane dominance that comes with many perks like safety, as well as the very notable aspect of the enemy having less of all of these things. So when you take healing with its heavy emphasis on time and put it in the hands of someone who not only has higher defenses, the ability to essentially fear enemies off of you through the fact that you can stat check them if they try to fight you, and their lack of offenses, then healing becomes even stronger and is a very dominant stat because you have more time in a fight and much more freedom in lane to heal up off poke and minions. And then if this wasn't bad enough, almost every healing stat scales offensively, so that lead issue is exacerbated even further because now literally every aspect of what a lead provides is being utilized, including things you probably wouldn't think much about, like mobility and range. This means that healing becomes an extremely oppressive attribute and is why we can't just buff healing as a solution, because making it stronger for the normal, non-snowballed fights ends up increasing it so much further for when you are ahead in snowballing. So then what's the actual solution to this? Well, as most problems go, there's many ways we could approach fixing it, but here I'll stop at just two. First, we could remove the offensive stat scalings through having healing be something like a flat on-hit amount, meaning the lead issue is lessened and is more fair. Another could be to have healing be more of a burst-oriented effect, akin to something like Gordrinker in Divine or Olaf's old W, which would work by matching the power creep while keeping it maintained and balanced. What this does is allow healing to feel strong and impactful due to the fact that it's less consistent and limited by cooldowns, while also helping to lessen the lead issue of being able to out-heal their damage and stay overly healthy with the spacer provided through a lead because the healing is limited in its use and not a permanent stat. Next is the Grievous Wounds issue, which has two primary points, being the fact that it affects kit-based healing and the 5-item issue. What I mean by the first is that kit-based healing, for example Gangplank's W or Soraka's W, are part of the champion's total power level, which means that those healing abilities are not only able to be much more finely tuned, but that the other aspects of the kit can be used as counterweights. For example, say Kael's healing is making her too dominant in lane due to the fact that she can remain overly healthy. Well, then we can go into her kit as a whole and diagnose the issue. For example, nerfing her Q slow so that the enemy can more consistently deal damage to her, or nerfing her E damage so that the enemy can more consistently remain in lane and match her healing without getting poked so easily. We don't even need to touch the healing at all in some cases to affect her, but items and runes on the other hand can't be so finely tuned due to the fact that it doesn't have the ability to consider only Kael. Items and runes are universal, which means if they did do something like nerf an item with only Kael in mind, it would affect many other champions who would also use that item or rune. So by having Grievous Wounds affect kit-based healing, it essentially just means that those champions that are already finely tuned and balanced are being singled out by Riot. And because of this, what it ends up doing is cause those champions to need to have their base power level buffed to compensate for the fact that they are objectively just worse off champions due to it existing, which then means now because they are literally just stronger than everyone else by default, it creates a scenario where players are then forced to build it just to get those champions back down to being balanced. And this is exactly what we saw with the Grievous Wounds buff in 10.23, where many of the more healing-centric champions got hit much harder than everyone else who just built some lifesteal, which then forced Riot to go into their kits and individually tune them to accommodate, with things like the Soraka R Cleanse, Sylas getting 4 pretty significant buffs in a short amount of time, or maybe the most obvious, which was the flat 10% increase to Mundo's ult. And then now, because those champions were often just better than other, more properly tuned champions, you were essentially forced to build Grievous Wounds, which was not only unfun for the Mundo or Raka player, because it was often going from plus 15% to minus 15% of a normal champion's power level, but also the enemy who was forced to build an item or get stat checked because of it. So when they reverted the buff in 12.10 and 12.11, what happened was that they were able to retune those healing champions back down to a more equal level to others, which then meant you weren't forced to rush Grievous Wounds anymore and meant it felt a bit better for healing-centric champions. But again, because it still affects kit-based healing even today, you were still essentially forced to build it eventually, because while it may not be as severe as it was, that issue still exists and will always exist with it affecting the kits. So in terms of solution, an easy one would just be to make it not affect kit-based healing, making it affect only bonus healing through things like items and runes, which still keeps it as that counterplay option similar to penetration for if the enemy stacks it too heavily. And I do understand that in this scenario, it doesn't really make sense why you would ever want to, due to the fact that there are so few sources of bonus healing today, but this is a solution that assumes healing would be much more properly fleshed out as an attribute, not only through various sources similar to lifesteal, but also for fighters as an alternative defensive stat. And this subject also ties into the second issue of Grievous Wounds, which is honestly more of just an explanation of why it exists, rather than an actual issue, which is the fact that players only have 5 item slots, which means if we did split the Grievous Wounds' value into 2 or more items, then the player is being forced to use too many of their limited item slots on it, which takes away from the item system and its fun. So what we want to do is have one item with a fairly high value, just like we see with the penetration items as well. And I've also seen the question of why Grievous Wounds even exist, where if we removed it, we could more properly balance healing and not have to force the enemy to buy any items. But the problem with this is that if Grievous Wounds didn't exist, healing would need to be such a low value that it feels really bad to play with, which for anyone that's played with Riftmaker, they probably understand this. By having Grievous Wounds, we can make healing feel impactful and have higher healing values because the counterplay option exists in a very similar way to the burst-oriented suggestion I gave. It's essentially the counterweight on a scale that keeps it balanced while allowing it to still feel impactful. And now for the last issue of healing, we have counterplay in the laning phase. Kit-based healing's main issue is that it affects the laning phase and can create a very unfun lane where there isn't any threat or intensity due to everyone staying too healthy. Historically, the best method of limiting this from happening was to have healing abilities limited by mana and needing investment through levels, meaning that while you could put points into it and use it to stay healthy, you would run out of mana quickly and be put in a spot where since you put points into it, your other abilities were weaker and you would typically lose traits because of it, which gave the enemy an opportunity to punish you for playing that way. But of course, over the years with various item and rune changes, we've seen mana largely degraded as a limiter, meaning that old idea of limiting healing through mana was now gone and now meant the counterplay of being aggressive and punishing your opponents for it was as well, which meant you could just walk back into the turret or play a bit safer and remain far too healthy as one of the healing champions. And while this did really only affect a small subset of champions, even today with some of the champions who haven't been addressed, like Senna or Nami, we can see just how frustrating it can be because they just play a bit safer and avoid fighting for a bit, using their healing to heal back up while you have to just sit there and watch from a distance, all while having little punishment for doing so. This is also why Yumi's E had that weird max mana cost that was very clearly Riot's desperate attempts to stop her from full healing her ally, and yet even then all it took was mana flow and presence along with the support item for that issue to be almost completely negated. So what Riot did to try and fix this problem was to nerf the healing of each ability, which meant the ability to hide and play safe was sorta kinda addressed because the healing abilities were simply just not viable and were objectively underpowered. And of course, this is an extremely lazy and pretty bad change that was pretty much just them smashing the smoke detector rather than fixing it, which ended up with that entire gameplay option being just removed entirely. But that's not actually the whole story, as for some, there was actually a bit of thought put into them, which was through them putting a combat requirement on the healing similar to Renekton's Q, which meant for the most part you couldn't just play safely and heal without counterplay, since you had to actually engage the enemy for the healing to take effect, which provided a bit of that counterplay to the enemy that the old limiters used to provide. For example, Tarek's Q and how rather than having it be a nuke heal, they tied it to him attacking the enemy through the cooldown reduction, which meant in combat it was strong, but you couldn't just hide back and full heal because you had to be there attacking for it to work. Another example is Gangplank and how they put the percent missing health on it to incentivize it as a clutch heal ability rather than one used to stay full health. And while I do think these changes are a pretty neat display of Riot's intellect that most people would have never realized, I still think we can do better, notably through the slashing of healing and pragmatic removal of the playstyle those abilities used to provide. So with this in mind, what could we do? Well, like I mentioned earlier in the video about how healing abilities are balanced as part of the kit as a whole, it means that we can provide counterplay through that, which makes it a lot more specific to the champion in question rather than being a general blanket fix we can put on every healing champion. For example, based on Gangplank's old kit, is to have his passive increase in damage the more stacks he accrues rather than the stacks being placed on the enemy, and then having his oranges remove his own scurvy stacks, which ends up cutting his damage output significantly, meaning he needs to understand that using his W to stay healthy in lane means being vulnerable to the enemy capitalizing on his lack of scurvy stacks. And that's pretty much it. Healing was left behind in the power creep of damage and time to kill by the fact that Riot couldn't simply just buff it due to the lead and offensive scaling issue that made it too oppressive of a stat. The Grievous Wounds issue is essentially just the fact that it works on kit-based healing, and healing had a counterplay issue through the degradation of its previous limiters, which was then addressed through gutting it rather than repairing the previous pillars it was built on, destroying an entire playstyle in the process and destroying the enjoyment those older abilities used to provide. Shout out to the people who asked for this. It was honestly kind of a slugfest of being super uninspired, but during that time I was also able to work on a few other topics that I'll probably get out sooner than later, so subscribe if you aren't, leave a like if you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.